welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. My name is Dana, and today's video is number 5 in my Neophyte series, and it's also video number 2 for my 6 Follow Me Phalaenopsis Orchids for the year 2022. So at the end of January, I made a video about these 6 Phalaenopsis orchids, and we were going to follow them throughout the year. And now that it's the end of April, 3 months later, we're going to do an update on each of the 6 Phalaenopsis orchids that we started with in January, talk about how they have developed and changed in the last 3 months. And kind of the purpose of this is for you to be able to have a gauge, kind of to assess your own Phalaenopsis orchids and what they're doing and how they are behaving and what actions you may or may not need to take, what's normal, what's not normal. So as we're following my 6 Phalaenopsis orchids throughout the year, we will talk about them, and then you can kind of compare your own orchids and see how they're doing in comparison. Now, in my first video, I did say, be cautious about comparing your orchid growing to someone else's. Everybody's environment is different. Everyone is going to get different results. And of course, our growing conditions are not the same from place to place. But, kind of fun to watch anyway, to see what someone else's orchids are doing and assess your own growing changes throughout the year. Okay. So I'm going to put up a picture of what these orchids look like in January, and I have them positioned the same way that I did back in January. So orchid number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I have them arranged the same in this video today, and you can see that I was not even really able to put them as close together because many of them are in spike now. But we're going to go one by one and talk through where they were in January and where they are now. Okay, so starting with orchid number 1, which is this large Phalaenopsis right here. And if you remember from the first video, we had 2 large Phalaenopsis here, 2 that were more mid-sized in the middle, and then the novelty or mini Phalaenopsis orchids were number 5 and 6. Okay, so we're starting with number 1 over here, which is a large Phalaenopsis orchid. And it does not look that much different compared to how it looked in January. But I know the history of this orchid, and it is one of my summer bloomers. And it is just now in late April putting on a bloom spike. So let me see if I can get that in the camera right there. That bloom spike is, hardly a ½ inch. And I know this one is a summer bloomer. It has always been that way. And that might mean that it has some Doritis in its background, which is now actually classified as Phalaenopsis. But sometimes later blooming Phalaenopsis orchids have some of that ancestry in their background. But this one relatively unchanged, except now it is spiking, and previously in January we may have thought that it was not going to bloom this year. Okay, so let me kind of push this one out of the way so I have a bit more room. This is number 2. It was spiking back in January, and it's doing really, really well. Let me get this bloom in front of the camera so it can focus. And gorgeous pink blushing bloom. Almost looks like a watercolor with the way it kind of bleeds into the white. But then the lip is rather striking with some burnt yellow colors. Really, really love this orchid. It has not bloomed for me since I purchased it, and I had forgotten what the bloom looked like, and now I can remember why I purchased it in the first place. This one is due for a repot this year, It's been in this pot for a couple of years at least, so when it's finished blooming, that will be a task for this orchid. Okay, so let's put this one aside. And orchid number 3 was developing its spike back in January, and it's still, under development here, under construction, as they would say. And looking well. It was repotted last year, so there's not going to really be anything that I need to do with this one other than enjoy its bloom and continue to develop the roots and leaves after the blooming cycle is over. This actually was an orchid that might not have bloomed, and if it hadn't, I wouldn't have been surprised because I had just repotted it later in the year at the end of 2021. Okay, and then orchid number 4 is actually quite interesting. It developed a bloom spike with branches, and this orchid was also purchased last year and repotted later in the year, and I would not have necessarily expected this one to bloom either, but it has. And it's almost a smaller version of the larger Phalaenopsis bloom that I just showed you. But you will also notice on these branched spikes that the buds on the very tips have blasted. So these little buds are just going to die away, as well as 3 or 4 buds on this branch, although 2 developed, and then, a couple of others that are going to blast. Now, let's think about why that may have happened. It's probably because this orchid sent out a bloom spike that it was not completely able to support. It doesn't have, a super robust root system in this pot. That's something that it's going to need to work on. And so what I will be doing as soon as all of these buds open, I'm going to go ahead and clip this spike down so that this plant can, for the rest of the growing season, focus on its roots and vegetative growth. I fully expect that next year, when it sends out a bloom spike, that the root system will be better developed. It will have had more time to be established in this pot, and it will be able to support this branched blooming that it likes to do. So this doesn't concern me. I think it's just a result of the recent trauma, I guess you could say, of this orchid coming into my environment, having to adjust, and being repotted. Okay, and then my 2 novelty Phalaenopsis orchids are simply not going to bloom this year. So let's talk about why. Before you might think that it's just a problem in general with the novelty or mini Phalaenopsis orchids, I want to show you one of the ones that was not in the 6 Follow Me Phalaenopsis orchids. It's similar to the others, has had the same growing conditions, and this one sent a spike perfectly fine. So it probably doesn't have anything to do with light or watering or feeding. So let's look at these 2 and think for a second why they didn't bloom. This one had a little bit of difficulty during the growing season. It is not what I would say secure in its pot. Okay, so it is a bit wobbly. And somewhere along the way, maybe more than once, it tipped over and it actually partially fell out of the pot, and the bark was put back in, but you can still see it's rather wiggly in the pot. These roots have not attached to this clay. So one of the things that you will sometimes read is that orchids won't bloom, or they won't maybe thrive as well as they can if they don't feel secure. So my plan for this orchid, in order to try and get it to bloom next season, is to repot it and get these roots in a situation where they can secure themselves a bit better, and maybe that will allow this orchid to bloom. Okay, so that's my plan for this one. And then the final novelty orchid, number 6, is also not going to bloom as best I can tell. And the thing to know about this one is that it never has bloomed. So there's a slight possibility that this one is just not mature enough yet to bloom, although I don't know that for sure. It's a no ID Phalaenopsis, so it's really difficult to know what mature size is for this one or what its background is. But this one has been in this pot for a while, and the media is probably beginning to be, a little bit old. I would prefer to have this in a plastic pot where I can actually see the root development. So I will be repotting this one this year, and I'm still not certain whether it's a potting issue or just maybe the fact that it's not quite mature enough to bloom, but in either case it's due for a repot, so that will be happening later. Okay, so that's my second update on the 6 Follow Me Phalaenopsis orchids for this year. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please give it a thumbs up, and the subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. Thanks so much for watching, and talk to you next time.